Hello and welcome to this first screencast on sport and society. So what we're going to be focusing on over our next few lessons is emergence and evolution of modern sport. Okay, so that's one of the sections of sport and society. We're also going to be looking at sport in the 21st century and finally also global sporting events. If we run for this first part, today's lesson and or today's screencast and our next lessons all going to be influenced around pre-industrial Britain. Okay, so how social and cultural factors shaped the characteristics of and participation in sports and pastimes in pre-industrial Britain. Now, with regards to specification, the following headings are what we need to focus on. So social class, gender, law and order, education, literacy, availability of time, money and transport. So a typical past paper question will look similar to what's on the screen in front of you. Explain two ways that the availability of time affected participation in pre-industrial sport, and also using practical examples, explain how transport and education affected the opportunities to participate in sport in pre-industrial Britain. So it's important you have an idea of the types of questions you may get asked on this section. So as I said, we're focusing on pre-industrial for this screencast and for our next lesson. However, we also need to be looking at post-1850 industrial Britain, 20th century Britain and 21st century Britain. Now, if you look at our title for our first lesson, pre-industrial, and then you've got post-1850 industrial Britain, the Industrial Revolution was huge for our society as a whole and therefore really big in terms of sport as well. Okay, so before 1850, so the 1800s, we just classed the time period as pre-industrial. So as you can see from the specification, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to get through each of these sections quite quickly. Okay, we're going to have to run through these sections. What you may use or what you may think as is we're going to have to leg it. Okay, we're going to have to leg it through this part of the specification so we get everything done. We're going to add a C in front of Leggett to help with an acronym that is going to ensure that we answer questions appropriately on this type of question. The C stands for class. Okay, now this is a hierarchical acronym. Okay, so the top is absolutely key for pre-industrial revolution. This class aspect is absolutely key for all of the other sections. Okay, so what this stands for is, as we've gone through previously on the previous slide, class, law and order, education, literacy, gender, income, time and transport. Now this acronym of Leggett or Cleggett will be used throughout each section. Tiny bits will be added to it. However, for this first kind of part, class is really important because class has an effect on participation in sport and what sport was like because of education, literacy, gender, income, time, transport, and so on. So, first of all, social class. Social and cultural factors shaping the characteristics of and participation in pre-industrial pastimes and sports. We are really keen to focus on two social classes. Okay, there were two social classes. We had lower class and upper class. There was no middle class at this time period. Lower class were peasants and land workers, and upper class were landowners and aristocracy. Okay, so if we are looking or thinking about this time period, we've got to think about the fact that this is going to be very much agricultural, seasonal time type of work. It is a really rural society. So as I said, you've got two classes, lower class and upper class. You were born into your classes, okay? So you couldn't kind of change classes at this point in time. You were born into them. You were either born into aristocracy or you're born into being a peasant, which is kind of like manual labor and so on. So in terms of the two classes, we have to look at what activities you potentially be working on or doing. So you'd be playing mob football as a lower class. Okay, we're going to get into that in the actual lesson and explain what mob football is. Or cockfighting. As the upper class, you'll be playing real tennis and fox hunting. Now, in terms of sport, upper class and lower class did participate in the same sports, however they played very different roles. So in cricket, you think about the lower class, they would have been the fielders and the bowlers, and the upper class would have had the fun part of smashing the ball, so they would have been the batsmen. Okay, so that is how social class potentially as an overview dictates the type of sports we play and the roles that we play within their sports and the characteristics of the sports as well. But we need to go into more detail. So social class, we always start with social class, and when we answer a question on Pre-industrial Britain, whether they ask about literacy and education, law and order, so on, we have to focus on social class. If we're going through to now the first social and cultural factor, we're looking at law and order. So pre-industrial Britain, law and order, is there any? How does it shape the characteristics of the sports that we play? How does it influence participation? So there is no law and order. Again, it's really important you've got down. This is due to there was no police force or no RSPCA. Therefore, how did this shape the characteristics of the sports that we played or the activities we took part in? They were very violent, and wagering happened, i.e. bets taking place, because there was no police. Violent, mob football was a very violent sport. Wagering, a lot of people wagered on prize fighting, well, the upper classes. And then there was no RSPCA, so the activity was very cruel. For example, cockfighting. So for your corner notes, you should have law and order as a title, no law and order due to no police force and RSPCA, and then explain some of that. And then you need a question that is going to give you the answer of law and order. For example, what suggests that games are violent, such as mob football, wagering to a place, prize fighting, law and order. Okay, so next section that we're going to be looking at. Now, this is where the classes come into real shape, okay? So this is where the hierarchical acronym that we have with CLEGIT, class being at the top. The next social factors that affect this are education and literacy. So who has it? How does it shape characteristics of the sports or activities that each class take part in? And how does it influence the participation of each sport? So, starting with the lower class, education, literacy. They were illiterate, okay? The lower class were illiterate. Therefore, the characteristics of their games, they were simple, and there were few rules, so there were unwritten rules. What type of sports did they play? They played mob football. However, the upper class, they were literate. Therefore, their games or activities were complex, and they actually had written rules within their activities. They played real tennis. As I said, we're going to go on about these in more detail in the actual lesson. Gender, okay, so it is a male-dominated society. So pre-industrial revolution is a male-dominated society. So when could females take part in sport, and how did it influence participation? So women were seen as the weaker sex in this time period. Activities would have to be non-violent, for example, smock racing or smock races. And exactly the same for the upper class in terms of women being seen as the weaker sex. Their activities had to seem ladylike, such as archery. They were not violent at all or physically exhausting. Availability of money. So who has money? How does it shape the characteristics of the sports that are being played or activities participated in? And how does it influence that? So lower classes, no, okay, they did not have much money, if any money. Characteristics, it meant they were simple, they were natural activities, there were no kind of expensive equipment and so on. Mob football being a prime example. Yes, the upper classes did have money. The characteristics were they could afford equipment and they had their own facilities, such as real tennis being an example. Availability of time, who had it, how did it shape characteristics, how does it influence participation? Lower classes had limited time, okay, they worked long hours out on the fields, okay, so their sports or the characteristics of their sports, they were very occasional activities, okay, so for example, mob football, Shrovetide, okay, so it took place at certain times of the year, they weren't playing it regularly or taking part in activity regularly. Upper classes, they had availability of times, okay, they had a lot of free time, so they were regularly doing these activities, and fox hunting would be an example of these activities. If we're looking at transport now, who has transport, how does it shape characteristics? Hopefully you're getting the gist. Lower class did not have any transport other than travelling by foot. These meant that the activities were local, such as mob football, and no transport formed activities such as pedestrianism, which we'll go on about in lesson. And then finally, the upper class transport. Yes, they did. They had horse and cart. So activities were less local. Real tennis at market towns. However, due to the poor quality of roads, this led to the upper classes actually building courts at their homes. So a lot to get down. Please make good notes on these. This is the kind of foundation of what we need to know. We're going to go on about these in a bit more detail in lesson. So look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Thank you. Bye.